I will formally start the webinar. Good morning, everybody. It is a great pleasure that I opened this webinar today entitled, Can Democracy Thrive Without a Strong Media? So before I proceed, I just would like to thank the Arizona State University and Andres Martinez in particular, who are both institutional members of COMEXI. So thank you very much for organizing this. The agenda for this webinar will consist of a 30-minute conversation between our two guests, followed by a Q&A session with the audience. And I would like to thank Professor Leonard Downie, former executive director of the Washington Post and current professor of ASU, for being with us today. And also, I would like to thank Carlos Bravo Regidor, associate professor at CIDE and a renowned journalist in Mexico. And before I pass the floor to Carlos, I will just want to remind you some details for all of you in the audience. If you want to ask a question, please type your name and type it on the chat box that is located on the upper right-hand side of your screen. Carlos will be moderating the Q&A session. And before we start, I thank again the Arizona State University, Professor Leonard, and Carlos. Thank you very much. Well, I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you to COMEXI and also to Arizona State University, to our friend Andres Martinez, who put this together as well. And well, thank you mostly to Professor Len Downie, who's been kind enough to share his time and his wisdom with us. I would like to kickstart this conversation, Len, if you will, talking about your experience in the Washington Post. In particular, I would like to ask you two questions regarding, it was your 44 years, in very different capacities, a whole professional trajectory within the Post. When you look back to your years, and to certain, like critical episodes, not only of your experience, but more generally of the history of the press in the U.S. and the press, the relationship between the press and the government and powers. In your perspective, what has changed, or what has remained?
Right.
When you compare it to nowadays.
Yes, that's a very good question. When I started out in 1964 as a summer intern at the Washington Post, the relationship between press and government was just beginning to change. During the Depression, during the World Wars, during the Korean War, the McCarthy era, the relationship between the press and the national government in particular was very close. And there was not much what I call accountability journalism. There was not much investigative reporting or other kinds of journalism that held those in power accountable. And then things began to change with Dwight Eisenhower not telling the truth about what happened when the U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union, when President Kennedy said that he wished the New York Times had published a story saying the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was coming. Because if they had published it, he asked them not to publish it before the invasion, and they did not. The invasion was a fiasco, and he said afterwards, "I wish they had published that story, and they would have stopped me from ordering the invasion." And then came the Pentagon Papers in 1971, when first the New York Times and then the Washington Post and then other newspapers after that, in defiance of the government initially, published stories about the Pentagon Papers, which was a study of the Vietnam War that showed the extent to which various administrations had lied about the American participation in the war. And the Supreme Court finally ruled after the Nixon administration tried to stop publication, ruled 6-3 that you could not engage in that kind of prior restraint. You cannot stop American news media in advance from publishing or broadcasting something unless it met a very, very high threshold of the threat to the country, which the Pentagon Papers did not. And as a result of that decision, the American government has never, ever again stopped publication of something in advance. They could not even doing it. And then came Watergate. I was one of the editors in the Washington Post investigative reporting about the Watergate affair, and resignation really convinced the whole rest of the media, because actually early on in our Watergate coverage, most of the rest of the media was not participating. They were not following our stories. They were not paying attention to what we were doing, or they were skeptical about what we were doing. And when it led to the resignation of the president, I think the news media in the United States realized that investigative reporting about the national government and everything else in the country is extremely important. Now we come up to now, and that has been continuing. Investigative reporting is now an essential part of news media in the United States. Even as news media have been changing through economic changes going on in the industry, investigative reporting remains a very high priority. I expect when the Pulitzer Prizes are announced next Monday, that probably half a dozen of them will be about investigative reporting, whatever category it's in. That's been typical of the prizes awarded so far this year by other entities. And so it's extremely important. In terms of the federal government, you are seeing with the Trump administration, led by the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN on television, extraordinary amounts of investigative reporting revealing things that are going on inside this administration that the president's not happy to see published, including in reporting about the nature of the investigations going on of the president. So investigative reporting is more important than ever. There's been a backlash from the government, led by the president, that has attacked the news media. See how the public reacts to that.
Well, that answer might take the conversation in very different directions. Let me just pinpoint to a couple of them. Number one, you mentioned, the explosion or the development, right? I think also the, investigative journalism acquiring, a very important, very solid prestige. I mean, Watergate has become, I think, in journalistic imagination, the ultimate threshold. I think that, in my experience, at least, working with investigative journalists, I think Watergate is always somewhere in the back of their mind, as, the last frontier of what can be done. And in a way, I think that's great because it's inspiring, and it becomes an engine for them, in moments of frustration where somehow, investigations lead to dead ends or become very chaotic. But on the other hand, it's problematic because, Watergate happened just once. And most of the times, investigative journalism does not produce that sort of a nuclear result. What is your take on the role of Watergate in journalistic imagination these days?
It is, as you say, it looms large in the journalistic imagination. I think all young reporters are, even though they weren't born when Watergate happened, are aware of it and are aware of how it changed American journalism, and are aware of thanks to the movie and the book. The movie, All the President's Men, gets shown over and over again in this country. Every young journalism student I've come across has seen it at least once. And so it really is a kind of inspiration, if you will, for investigative journalism. However, presidents are not going to be forced to resign all the time, he said, while Trump is under investigation. But otherwise, you just don't expect that to happen. But there's been lots and lots of impact of investigative reporting in lots of different ways in this country, forcing all kinds of changes at local, state, and national levels of government. And you can see it happening right now. You can see the impact that the investigative reporting about this administration is having on its behavior, on how the public sees what it's doing. And it remains a very important part of American journalism.
Of course. And, talking about inspiration for journalists, what can you tell us about I assume most of our guests who are watching and listening to this conversation have seen the movie The Post.
Yes.
You worked as a consultant for that movie. What was it like, to, somehow turn the tables, so to speak, from being, a journalist who could very well be in the movie to becoming a consultant for the people doing the movie? How was that translation? How did that translation work? What was it like for you?
Right. Well, the director of the movie, Steven Spielberg, and the script writers, Josh Singer in particular, were very determined for this movie to be very realistic and accurate. They thought it was very important for this movie to be coming out at this time when there's all this friction going on between press and government in the United States, and where the president's actions towards the press are being questioned, and certainly by the news media, not dissimilar from what Nixon was doing. In fact, it's very interesting if you think about it. The tweets that the president engages in when he's attacking the press is almost exactly the same as what Nixon was saying inside the Oval Office about the press when he was president, except we didn't know it at the time. It wasn't until the tapes came out and were made public that we knew he had exactly the same attitudes. So it seems to me it made the movie very, very timely, and that's what the director and the scriptwriter and the actors thought, and they wanted to be as accurate as possible. And I was in that newsroom in 1971 during the Pentagon Papers time. I was not involved in the Pentagon Papers because I was on the city desk at the time. I was a very young journalist. But I watched what was going on, and of course, I've known since then exactly what happened. So I was able to provide information. Myself and two other people from the Washington Post were able to help them make sure that the newsroom scenes were accurate, that the ways in which reporters and editors talked and behaved was reasonably accurate. They had to put a couple fictional things in the movie just to make the movie more interesting, but they did not have anything to do with the substance of the movie. So it was interesting to be on the set and to be consulted by the scriptwriter and occasionally by the director about whether or not something they were doing was real or not. And by and large, they were very responsive to my suggestions.
You were a young reporter when the Pentagon Papers scandal broke out.
Yes, I actually was a young editor on the city desk.
Okay, so a young editor on the city desk. What would that young editor tell a young journalist who's now dealing in the Trump era with the Russia probe?
Right. When the New York Times first started publishing the Pentagon Papers, and then the court stopped them when the Nixon administration went to court and temporarily stopped them, then the Washington Post began publishing them, and then the administration went to the courts and temporarily stopped the Post. Until the Supreme Court decision came along, we were worried about whether or not the government of the United States, even under the First Amendment, was going to be able to tell newspapers what to publish and what not to publish, if the Supreme Court didn't rule the way it did. So the Supreme Court decision was it's hard to say in words how exciting and how empowering it was for all journalists, even somebody like me on the city desk of the Post, not involved in the particular coverage of the Vietnam War at that time, how empowering it was that the Supreme Court said the government cannot tell us what not to publish. And it's unique in the world that way. I mean, there's some other countries that have that embedded in law, but it hasn't been tested the way this was tested with the United States Supreme Court. And so it's a uniquely freeing thing for the American press. And it's, as I said, it's empowering for all of us, and it is to this day.
That's so interesting because I think this brings us to our core question today about if democracy can thrive without a strong media. I've seen that most of this discussion, not only in the U.S. but globally speaking, that the freedom of the press or freedom of expression is under threat in many different ways in many different parts of the world. But, circumscribing this conversation to the U.S., at least for the purpose of this question, it has always struck me that the focus is on the media. Because in a way, it is not exactly the media itself who's being attacked or under threat, but journalism. Because when we ask the question, can democracy thrive without a strong media, we're thinking about journalism, not necessarily about the media. Fox News is the media. Mm-hmm. Can democracy thrive without a strong Fox News? Hell yeah. So, in a way, what does this hostility against journalism mean? What's the largest significance? What is its political or social effect? Or in your opinion, in your experience or your perspective, what's its impact upon democracy if we do this sort of a small correction and we focus more specifically in journalism and not necessarily on the whole phenomenon of the media?
I think that's an excellent point, because journalism comes from everywhere now in the era of the internet. Journalism comes from individual people all around the world. Journalism comes from nonprofit news organizations. Journalism comes from universities and their journalism students. It comes from freelancers. It comes from all over. I think that's a really good point. It's not whether or not Fox News or NBC ought to be surviving, but the journalism needs to survive as the media, because news media are changing, and the internet is changing the way news is reported, the way news is disseminated. So I think that's a really important point. I have to say something about Fox News, though. I'm a First Amendment absolutist, and while a lot of things on Fox News drive me crazy as a journalist, and I'm very disapproving of them, Fox News needs to be able to survive. I think what's happening now is, you see, I don't know to what extent this is the case in Mexico, but certainly in the United States, you see this division amongst the public now, which kind of journalism they're interested in, and whether or not it's journalism they agree with or not. Because even as Fox News is, for instance, the New York Times and the Washington Post both have larger audiences on the internet than Fox News has. The three broadcast networks have much larger audiences than Fox News has. So there's a Fox News audience, but there's also audiences for other kinds of journalism as well. And when you see the growth of the audiences for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I mean paid audience, people that are paying to subscribe all around the world to these two news organizations that are being so aggressive in their investigative reporting, it means that democracy is going to survive in some form, and the media and journalism will survive in the United States. I am more concerned about countries where the authorities have cracked down so much on journalism that it's hard to produce it in any form, and where it seems like the only hope is people trying to tell the truth through some forms of digital communications, even as those countries shut that down as well.
Yes. Well, I think Mexico is one of those cases, not necessarily because there's an official or a systematic crackdown, but because there's this sort of gray zone, particularly at the local level and with the local press, where authorities where it's very difficult to distinguish between authorities, organized crime organizations, but most of the aggressions, most of the attacks against journalists come from that gray zone. And one of the things, that we come over and over to in Mexico is the fact that, we talk a lot about the media, we talk a lot about investigative journalism, but there's another variable in the equation, which is the public,
In the cloud.
The press needs a strong public,
¿Este o el de diciembre?
so to speak. And I think that's one of the things that papers like the New York Times or the Washington Post or outlets like CNN are actually relying on. And one of the sources of their strength is not only the quality of the journalism they're producing, but also the strength of their respective publics.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. It's a highly divided country, so there's very strong public support for those news media, and there's also strong public support for other kinds of media that are communicating primarily right-wing messages at the moment. What's important, I think, is and then there's a whole bunch of there's a lot of the general public that's not actually paying much attention at all. And that's what concerns me. So it's hard for them to differentiate between what is truth and what is not truth, because they just aren't paying that much attention, and they're being bombarded through social media with all different kinds of messages. And so what's beginning to happen in this country is a movement called news literacy, where to try to educate children in schools, only children in high schools, college students, and even adults to help them understand how they can find truthful, factual news. It's still a relatively small movement, but it's many different aims in it, including this university and including some large institutions in the country. So I think that's very important for the future, that movement grows and helps educate people about how to find truth in their media.
Although, of course, I mean, in order to foster media literacy or like journalistic literacy, you need the media, you need journalism to happen. I was just, reading a couple of days ago, a study about so-called news deserts, places where, local newspapers have collapsed, where there is really not a strong or a thriving public sphere, and the authors of the study were saying these are the places where there's a certain coincidence between these places and the places where Donald Trump performed better, electorally speaking. So, I mean, the thing is not only to create, the capabilities for the public to be able to consume and to discriminate information, but what about one of the leading places or leading activities in this regard is the local press, and the local press is really under a lot of pressure.
Yes, the local press is under a lot of economic pressure because of the demise of advertising as a principal support of local news, and because some owners of large numbers of newspapers, like a investor called Alden Capital that owns about 173 newspapers around the country, they're primarily just trying to extract profits out of these newspapers, and as a result are shrinking the newsrooms and shrinking the news coverage. And this is a very serious issue. There are some countervailing trends going on. There are a small but growing number of universities, like Arizona State University, whose journalism departments have started up news media, local news media and state news media in different parts of the country, and that's one way of augmenting the of filling in where there are problems with local coverage, and also there are nonprofit news organizations starting up around the country. Many of them have started up around the country that are covering local news and state news in different parts of the country. So that's encouraging. And NPR, National Public Radio, public broadcasting, has also been focusing on increasing local news coverage around the country, and has raised money to do it. And a number of the NPR stations in different parts of the country are increasing their local news coverage to try to make up for what's missing in newspapers in particular, and to some extent in local broadcast stations. That study is a little concerning to me, the one that you cited, because I'm not sure about both things are concerning. One is the sort of blind support for Trump's brand of politics, and the other is less local news, so-called news desert situations. I'm not sure one causes the other, because I'm not sure that the people who are who voted for Trump have feelings about the country that are not necessarily going to be changed by better local news coverage. And yet at the same time, I think local news coverage is extremely important. So we are in a very critical period to see where we're going to be, where we're going to wind up in terms of the strength of local news coverage in the United States, which of course is relatively unique again in the United States because of its size. So you still, even if your local news coverage isn't very good, you still have access, obviously, through the internet to lots of other coverage of the nation and the world, which is helpful. But I'm very concerned about the future of local news coverage.
Sure. Well, and I mean, yes, I think you raise a fair point about, not assuming there is a strong causality between these two phenomena. But I think there's a larger context about, political polarization or social polarization. Arthur Miller used to say that a good newspaper is a nation talking to itself. And with this phenomenon that, you referenced in passing about, people getting used to consume news and information that only, correspond to their own preferences or values or biases. well, that renders it more difficult even to talk about the possibility of a nation talking to itself. These are like different groups only talking, with people who think alike. And this is really a challenge for journalism because, I mean, you can say, we're trying to produce more quality investigative journalism, but there's also this question about how do we get it to the people that actually need to read it, even if they don't want to,
Right.
for the health of the nation, for the health of the republic.
That is a very difficult question to answer. That states the problem precisely. Because of cable television and because of the internet, audiences have fractured into various interest groups of different kinds. Whether it's narrowly sports news or financial news, or if it's liberal leaning news in the eyes of the audience, or conservative leaning news, and they all have different facts. Fact bases that they're presenting to people. The RAND Corporation in this country, which is a think tank that mostly does research for the federal government, has decided that this is such a serious problem that they have started a project to explore and figure out what to do about what they call truth decay, the decay of truth in the United States. There are not many shared facts, not many shared truths anymore, and it's hard for me to figure out an answer to this, except for the truthy news media, the fact-based news media, to be as vigorous as possible in doing what they're doing, and to work hard with the possibilities that exist in the digital world to push that out to as many people as possible through social media and elsewhere, so that even if you're not receptive to it, it still may fall on your digital doorstep.
Yeah, sure. Well, one last question from my end before we open the conversation for people for our guests who are following this webinar. Len, what do you think? I mean, because you have a very long experience, as a journalist, as an editor, and now you're a professor at the Cronkite School, one of the leading schools, journalism schools in the U.S. What is it in your perspective, and with the hindsight that all your years in this business give you? What is it that young journalists, that students, aspiring to be journalists should know about journalism that you think they might be missing in terms of their formal training?
It varies so much from journalism school to journalism school. So I don't know I know there are journalism schools that are not anything like the Cronkite School. So I want to turn that question around. I want to talk about the strengths that I think are of the Cronkite School. What goes on here, and again, a growing number, but still small number of American journalism schools, is a focus on professional journalism education. In other words, not just a bunch of studies of the media and classes that are divorced from the real world, but actually doing journalism while you're studying it. So every single student at the Cronkite School has to be engaged in a professional program before they graduate. We have the Cronkite News, which has a state bureau here that is the largest news organization covering state government in Arizona. Is the Cronkite School. The only Washington bureau in Washington, D.C., covering aspects of the federal government that affect Arizona and the Southwest is the Cronkite School. None of the news media in Arizona have a Washington bureau. Only the Cronkite School has one, therefore they provide this coverage for people to the news media of Arizona, which wouldn't exist without the Cronkite School. It also does a nightly newscast 5 nights a week on the public broadcasting station here, with the students presenting the news, and they don't cover murders and traffic accidents and fires. They cover government and the sustainability and business and other important things. So journalism schools should be providing news and engaging their students in professional news work. And the schools that are not doing that are not preparing their students for the new world. The other thing is it's a completely multimedia education. No longer is there a print track and a broadcast track and a public relations track. All those things are still being taught, but all the students here have to do all those things. and have to learn all the different kinds of multimedia skills, videography and coding and all that sort of thing, so that they are ready to be hired by any kind of news organizations in any kind of capacity. I think is very important to have all these young people who are being newly trained in this new world to be available to American news media.
Just as a follow-up to that, you mentioned two very important things in regards to which the Cronkite School, I think it's at the vanguard. On the one hand, what's been called the teaching hospital model, learning journalism on the go as you perform it, a bit like swimming, right?
Yes.
You can only learn to swim if you jump into the pool and start swimming.
Or if you're sitting in the stands and somebody in the pool is showing you how to swim, which is still, I think, at too many journalism schools.
So that's one thing. The other one is about, multimedia, becoming, a full-terrain journalist, not only, for the written press, but for, radio, TV, internet, etc. But there's a third dimension in terms of, people like us who are, in the business of training journalists, which is specialized knowledge, what Thomas Patterson has called, knowledge-based journalism.
Yes.
What is your experience, in your professional experience or also in Cronkite in that regard?
Well, in Cronkite, the students do have beats in these professional programs. They do have to learn about that particular subject, but they're also encouraged to learn about subjects, outside the journalism school. They don't just take journalism courses. So they're encouraged to become expert in one area or another in their schooling. And when I was running the Washington Post, that was something I often looked for in prospective hires. I was looking for the person that not only was a good journalist in their university, but also had learned a lot about China or had learned a lot about business. And then the other thing is that is for further education, which is to say there are parts of the Cronkite School, such as in the business journalism, that exist to help professional journalists learn more about their subject. And in fact, the Cronkite School this spring will be having a special program for 16 selected journalists around the country, in which the Mayo Clinic, which is a very important health organization in this country, the Mayo Clinic and the Cronkite School will be teaching those 16 journalists in a very intensive week all about the current issues in healthcare, including taking them into operating rooms and taking them into the emergency room and having experts at the Mayo Clinic on various subjects, teaching them the kinds of things they'd be teaching medical students. They'll be teaching to these reporters. So that kind of continuing education is one of the things that Cronkite does. It's not the only university that does that. And that's very important too, that you have further education. When we would assign somebody to the Pentagon, for example, at the Washington Post, we would send them off to the defense defense university for a week or two of intensive education, so that they would know more about the military.
Oh, that's super interesting. Well, I could go on and on and on with my questions, but I see that our guests are also starting to ask questions themselves, so I'm going to turn the microphone to them. And I'm sorry. I'm going to read you one of the questions we just got from Rodrigo Jimenez from the youth program of COMEXI. Rodrigo wants to know what you think of the Sinclair Broadcast Group's promos that were broadcasted in several local broadcasters in the U.S. regarding the, quote, troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories, end of quote, also known as fake news. Is this a new way of spreading fear and attacking a competitor through media?
Yes, it is. It is new. The Sinclair Group has 100 and some, almost 200 television stations around the country that they own, and they're trying to merge with another station owner that would add dozens more stations to them, so that they would pretty much have a station in every single city of any sort in the country. And they are avowedly conservative. Well, they're not avowedly conservative. Now the owner is saying he's not. But in fact, it is conservative. It has a regular, I don't know if it's nightly or weekly, commentary from a very right-wing person, for example. And then they were trying to have force the anchors to read this editorial that was essentially running down their competitors and essentially saying that anything that is not, from their point of view, is not factual. And this is very difficult for the local stations around the country because their credibility is going to be eroded by that. They'll probably wind up left with, because there are multiple stations in each city, they'll probably be left in each city with an audience that is primarily from their point of view, and the rest of the audience will go elsewhere. And that's not good. And then there's been a very strong backlash against what Sinclair was doing. There are congressmen that want to investigate it, and there's been a lot of media criticism of them. They're arguing back, but it's become quite a controversy.
Another question from Cristobal Rodriguez. He's asking us, what's the approach you believe democratic governments should take regarding social media platforms, considering, the recent events about Cambridge Analytica and Russian interference in the American election?
This is a difficult question. We just had 2 days of hearings with Mark Zuckerberg, who is the founder and CEO of Facebook. Because on the one hand, you do not want to interfere with people's First Amendment rights to say what they want to say, including on social media. On the other hand, when they're not people, when they're bots it's coming not from ordinary folks, but from other countries or from vested interests and so on, you would like people to know that. You want to have transparency. And I think that's probably the best answer to this, is to enforce some kind of transparency, because right now Facebook and the others are not being transparent about how you receive the kinds of advertising you receive targeted to you, or the kinds of postings on social media that don't actually come from real people. So the government's got to figure out how can they intervene to force that transparency without violating anybody's First Amendment rights. And that's a real issue right now. Yes.
It's a difficult equation. We have a number of questions about Mexico, or the Mexican, the Mexican journalism environment. A question from, let me check, from Amy Glover. She's asking you, can you please speak as to why you think there is so little investigative journalism in Mexico? Does it all come down to a security threat and a lack of confidence in institutions that will back reporters up and protect them from government retribution or organized crime?
Yes, I think that's exactly the right answer to that question. We have heard in this country occasionally from brave investigative journalists in Mexico, including some that have had to leave the country and can no longer operate there because of their security. I feel very strongly that the national government of Mexico, beginning with the president of Mexico, needs to make very clear this is wrong, and that has not happened yet, and needs to find ways to deal with. It's on one hand, organized crime is hard to deal with, and when they're killing and intimidating journalists, that's hard for the government to deal with. But it's not hard for the government, should not be hard for the government to deal with instances in which it's the government itself that is interfering with the freedom of the press in Mexico, that is turning a blind eye or actually actively engaged in attacks on journalists. That is absolutely wrong. I understand from you, the American ambassador there has been taking a lead in trying to do something about this, but it's really up to the government, the ruling party, the president of the country, to make clear that this is a high priority, that free press in Mexico is a high priority, and that has not happened yet, and it's a disgrace.
Yes, we have a sort of follow-up question by another guest, MAC. They mentioned that alongside countries like Syria or Iraq, Mexico is considered one of the most dangerous countries to be a journalist. Should we consider this a sort of symptom, that violence against journalists, of something larger, of an armed conflict? Should we start thinking about the possibility of naming these things in a different way to actually start understanding what is going on?
Well, that's certainly an interesting idea. I don't know exactly what the name should be, but yes, I think more attention should be drawn to this. As much attention as possible should be drawn to this problem, and that it's a democratic issue. It's not just about news media. It's not just about individual issues. It's about democracy in Mexico, and it needs to be recognized that way by politicians and by government.
Pulling away a bit from the Mexican case, we have another question from Georgina Jimenez saying, about independent media. What is the model? I would add the business model you were encouraged. I mean, there's a whole phenomenon worldwide about the traditional business model of the press being disrupted by the digital revolution.
Yes.
What is, in your take? What are, in your take, the most, inspiring or the examples that make you more optimist in terms of the challenge that the digital revolution represents for the traditional business model of the press?
Right. That's a very good question. It is a worldwide phenomenon. In the United States, the things that are encouraging me are, first of all, that some of the larger media organizations are spending the money to grow audiences digitally, to take advantage of the digital revolution, to grow their audiences in a way in which subscriptions, the payment for news comes from the audience rather than from advertisers. So that the Washington Post and the New York Times, to cite two examples, I don't know if there are more, the revenue that they now get from their paid subscriptions, digital subscriptions, more than 2 million for the New York Times, more than 1 million for the Washington Post, that revenue now exceeds their advertising revenue. So as their advertising revenue continues to shrink, they're growing their subscription revenue. They also are engaged in other ways to make money. News organizations have been, because they were so fat and happy through most of the 20th century, they did not really worry about other ways in which they needed to support themselves. So, for instance, the Washington Post, now owned by Jeff Bezos, who separately runs Amazon, but he's spending a lot of his own money in his ownership of the Washington Post to do research into ways in which news can be better disseminated digitally, into how what kinds of software you should have for a news organization to take advantage of the digital world. And not only are they using that software at the Washington Post, they're selling it. They're selling it to other news organizations, which brings in other revenue for the Post. Some of these news organizations are putting on events where they charge people admission to events, where newsmaking events, and so on. So there's finally in the commercial news media, in a kind of beginning to figure out what are other ways to bring money in besides advertising. Second thing that's encouraging to me is public media. Nonprofit news organizations. Some of them are digital news organizations with their own websites. There are scores of them now around the United States. They're fragile. They're always dependent on memberships and on contributions from the public. And the same thing with National Public Radio, with the public radio system in the United States. Hundreds of radio stations around the country, in addition to NPR, National News Organization, and they're growing. They're growing because they're able to raise money from individuals and from foundations who care about the future of news in the United States. These are not panaceas yet. We're used to the United States. All during the 20th century, news was completely supported by advertising, and you just took that for granted. And that's no longer the case. And so these various ways of trying to get around that, trying to make up for that, are encouraging to me, but they're not yet a solution, not yet a single solution.
We have another question from Ignacio Rosalanda. What do you think about new or incipient media projects like the Young Turks or Democracy Now? And I would add to the question, phenomena like, John Oliver, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert.
Right.
Do you think they provide a new sort of they provide pluralism to the media environment? What's their role? What's their contribution?
Yes, absolutely. They provide pluralism, different points of view, and different ways of looking at the news, different ways to emphasize the news. I used to be a purist when I was a working journalist, And I thought there should be a strong division between news and opinion and so on. And what I'm finding now is that there's value to news as part of entertainment, to the merging of news and opinion when it's labeled as such, so that the news pages of newspapers and the news casts on television should still be strictly factual and not opinion, not what Sinclair is trying to do with its stations. But at the same time, there should be outside those. I'm welcoming the entertainers who are essentially getting involved in news, and various kinds of news organizations that have points of view. The Pulitzer Prize for environmental reporting a few years ago was won by an environmental news website, which makes no bones about the fact that it is pro-environment and anti-climate change, and yet is doing very good journalism. And so that's I welcome that, and I watch Colbert every night now, and it's interesting the way in which he presents the news. He presents facts, but facts obviously from a point of view, and I think that's good.
We have a question from our mutual friend Andres Martinez. He's thanking us for what we're doing. He has a quick question for me, which I will answer really quickly and then turn it to you, Len. He's asking me, what do you think the media coverage of this election cycle in Mexico is qualitatively different from the coverage of past elections? Is journalism in Mexico evolving towards a more American model along the lines Len was describing? Well, I think that, there's a certain paradox going on with media coverage of the current presidential election in Mexico. On the one hand, we have, an election that is being covered, as in most democracies it happens, alongside, what's being called horse race coverage, horse race journalism. Mm-hmm. The question about the competition itself, who's leading, who's running behind, who's trying to reach, the head of the race, what are their places, which is a sort of journalism that's been very criticized because it lacks focus on the issues. It doesn't really pay attention to many of the things that are happening, where the cameras are not pointing at. And at the same time, this race in Mexico is really not that interesting because, the leading candidate is really, really, really far from the second and third place. And the media is trying to, I think, at least when you see the abundance of analysis or of opinion spaces trying to, talk about the election, is trying to somehow, there's a certain inflation of expectations in terms of the race, where actually the race is kind of boring for most of the time, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we've seen the Electoral Tribunal just decided to insert a candidate in the ballot that had really not fulfilled the requisites. So that actually, represents a challenge to horse race journalism in terms of, we're focusing on the horses, but there's a problem with the running field. The fact that the Electoral Tribunal really made a decision that has been unanimously condemned, it should, make the media focus more on the conditions of the race than the race itself. So that would be my answer, but I would like to turn this to you, Len, in terms of your opinion, more generally speaking, of horse race journalism in times of elections.
Right. It's a perennial problem in the United States, too. It always has been, because, people get excited about that. And competition, in sports and quiz shows on television and in politics is always very exciting for people. And you can just see the audience reaction. You can see how the audience pays attention to that kind of coverage. And I'm worried that the 2018 congressional election in this country, obviously the president will not be up until 2020, but the congressional election is extremely important, whether or not Congress is going to change in important ways as a result of this election. There are many, many more open seats than usual, many more retirements from Congress. The electorate is clearly very volatile. I'm a little concerned that too much of the coverage at this stage is not only horse race coverage, that is to say, are the Democrats going to make the comeback? Are they going to take over the House? and looking at individual races in terms of whether it's going to change from a Trump majority in a particular congressional district to a Democratic majority in this election. But I'm also concerned that too much of the coverage, from my point of view, is pro and anti-Trump. That the main issue that's being covered is whether or not people like or don't like Trump and what he's doing, as opposed, as you say, to the issues. There are underlying issues out there. The underlying issues are responsible for Trump being elected president of the United States. And I don't yet see, and I see lip service being paid to that in some of the coverage, but I don't see nearly enough coverage that is on the ground, not looking at whether this congressional district is going to switch from red to blue, but why is it in play? What's going on? What's on the voters' minds? And we need to see much more of that coverage during the course of this election.
We have another question from Lina Pulido. She's asking, what is your prediction of the future for Washington, for the White House, regarding investigative journalism? Do you think that issues such as the Russian interventions in the presidential elections will provide any answers or create enough pressure for this administration to somehow change the course of politics?
This administration's already changed the course of politics, obviously, on many fronts, and it's being well covered. For instance, normally the Environmental Protection Agency would get, normally there aren't even reporters assigned to it all the time anymore. But the dramatic changes that are being made by the administrator of that, who's essentially doesn't believe in climate change, and is rolling back a lot of regulations, is being closely covered. And so I'm pleased to see that a lot of coverage of what government's actually doing is greatly increased in this administration because they're changing so many things. And it's interesting because as you look at the coverage of what it is they're changing, and then you see that the things that they are changing, the regulations that they're rolling back, were not being very well covered when they were first instituted in previous administrations. And so I'm glad to see that the controversy about this administration is at least focusing journalistic attention on what a government is actually doing, even though I don't think that coverage is necessary. It's not going to change what this administration is going to do. The only thing that can change that is if Congress does change political parties and they put some kind of pressure on the administration and use the budget, which Congress controls, to rein the administration in certain ways. But in terms of the first part of that question, investigative reporting, this administration has been great for investigative reporting about government because so much of it's being engaged in, and because the administration itself is despite Trump's attacks on the press, it is a very open administration when it comes to finding out what's going on. There are people talking all the time. It's easy to know what they're doing, and the press is taking advantage of that, and that's a good development.
Chris Rodriguez asks, we need to empower the trustability of the news and media characters. How do you believe we can deal with fake news or information aimed at manipulating not just opinions but feelings?
Yes.
At the very end, that at the very end are very important changers for democracy using social media platforms.
Right. Well, I'm not an expert on social media. I have watched these hearings with interest, and it's clear that there's a big issue there. As I said earlier, I think the government is facing a difficult decision about how to create transparency so you know what it is that you're seeing, where it came from, how you're being manipulated on the one hand, and on the other hand, to still allow First Amendment freedom of speech. And it's very difficult. That does not necessarily involve the news media. That's about social media. In terms of the news media, as I said earlier, I think it's really important for the news media to be as transparent as possible. The Washington Post now, for example, routinely in covering this administration in investigative stories, no longer says the story relies on confidential sources inside the White House. It will say 12 confidential sources who include people who work in the White House and people outside the White House whom they're talking to. Well, that's much more transparent. And the president will still say those sources don't exist, but it's harder for him to convince people of that when you're being more transparent and more particular about how you're describing your sourcing. And the news media needs to be much more transparent about all those kinds of things now, and open to reacting to public criticism when the news media is wrong, which again is happening more. And I think that's important for building public trust. And then, as I say, this news literacy effort. It will be interesting to see if we can educate Americans. Right now it's a small number, but educate larger numbers of Americans about the difference between fact and non-facts.
Your answer, putting the emphasis on transparency, brings us to a question about Mexico again. Ace Fraley asks, how can media in Mexico, specifically printed newspapers, be trusted when the public knows that more and more of their survival of their business models depends on government-paid publicity?
Yeah, this is a really serious problem, which we obviously don't have in the United States. My first answer would be one that may not be very helpful, which is to let the public know what's going on. To what extent is your revenue coming from the government? To what extent does that increase government influence over what you do? To tell the public when you don't publish something because the government said not to, or when the publication of something has been changed because of government pressure. I realize that's not a very helpful answer because that could get, obviously, people in trouble with the government. But again, I just think being more transparent is essential. And if there were brave journalists who would try doing that, I think it'd be helpful.
We have another question from Rodrigo Arteaga. As a reader, who are the young investigative journalists or investigative journalism teams that interest you the most in the U.S. and or abroad? Have you found innovative ways of getting to know readers or your audience offline? That's to say, to start a conversation and to build a community with them beyond social media comments or analytics?
Well, the first part of that, for the answer to the first part of that is that I have noticed a proliferation of. I was one of the founders of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Group in the United States, which is now a worldwide organization, and I've seen through that the amazing proliferation of investigative reporting around the world, including in countries where it's dangerous to engage in it, but also in countries where it's not, but just had not done. There was not a history of this previously, and we have some of those investigative journalists actually come to the Cronkite School to spend a year under a government grant to further their development. And so I'm very encouraged about the fact that investigative reporting is growing around the world in various forms. In some cases, it's established news media that are now engaging in it when they hadn't before. And in other cases, it's these nonprofit investigative reporting projects around the world. There also are international investigative reporting projects. There's one based in the United States, which uncovered the Panama Papers, for example, that involves dozens of journalists all around the world working together. The one good thing about the digital revolution is that it can create gigantic international teams of investigative reporting, as we've seen happen in some of these cases. And so I think that's a good development. It's encouraging.
I'm going to, take advantage of my privilege as moderator to ask one last question. There's been so much talk about the Washington Post's new motto, "Democracy dies in darkness."
Yes.
And I would like to turn that a bit around and ask you about, what happens when, quote unquote, there's too much light. In a way, there's this phenomenon of social fatigue. When we have sort of an excess of scandals, there's an erosion, I think, of the public's attention and the public interest when a scandal becomes an everyday phenomenon. I mean, as a reader, as a consumer of news, I can tell you it's, exhausting, and at some point, news and information, just become noise, and it's just too much to take in. And I think that as professors or as journalists, we have a responsibility to take this seriously. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it's out of our control, which is to say that you're not only being inundated with scandals, you're being inundated with information of all kinds. And so we just each of us needs to figure out how we're going to it's a serious problem that you're investigating, somebody's going to pay attention to it, and that's why you keep doing it.
Oh, well, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Len, for your time and your wisdom. Thank you also to Arizona State University, to Croncat School, and to COMEXI. Thank you, most of all, to our participants. This video will be available shortly on COMEXI's website and social media. Thank you so much, Len.
Thank you very much, and for all the participants, too. Those were excellent questions.
All right, so this is a wrap. Thank you all. You can see these videos, I just said, on COMEXI's website and social media shortly. And thank you to Andres Martinez, in particular, to Mariana Campero, who put this together.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.